on issues of environment and development in India and globally. She has worked extensively on climate change with a particular interest in advocating for an ambitious and equitable global agreement. Her work on air pollution, water and waste management, as well as industrial pollution, has led to an understanding of the need for affordable and sustainable solutions in countries like India, where the challenge is to ensure inclusive and sustainable growth. She was a member of Indian Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change. In 2005, the Center for Science and Environment, under her leadership, was also awarded the Stockholm Water Prize. In 2016, Time magazine selected her as one of the most influential people in the world. She received the Order of the Polar Star Award from the Swedish government in 2017. CSE received the Indira Gandhi Prize for Peace, Disarmament and Development for 2018. Dr. Narain is also included in the world's list of 100 most influential people in climate policy for 2019 by Apolitical. On behalf of our club, Speaker Series India at Berkeley, I extend warm gratitude to you for joining us today and giving us your valuable time. It's a pleasure to be able to host you, ma'am. We also thank our audience for joining us from around the world. We hope you enjoy the session. You can send in the questions in the Q&A box if you have any, and we shall entertain those towards the end of the webinar. It'll be, all your questions will be moderated and we'll try to ask most of them towards the end. Thank you. Without taking much time, I think I'll begin, ma'am. So Sunita Narain has been associated with the entire climate change movement in India, and how your work began before we even realized that climate change is a problem in countries like India. It is very impressive to see that you struggled and you tried to get the problem of climate change on India's table, or India's desk of all the problems we had at that point. So, ma'am, my first question to you would be, what inspired your career choice, or what inspired you to take this path?
Thank you, Pratyushan. Firstly, let me thank all of you for having me over today, and also for everyone who's joining this conversation. And thank you so much for being there, for listening. Pratyusha, I mean, life is sometimes just about doing something and then finding that it is exactly what you want to do for your whole life. I have to say, I was a student, and so I'm from Delhi, and I studied in modern school, Barakhamba Road, which is a public school in Delhi, and I got very interested in environmental issues, and that's now 1980. Nobody really knew what environment was about, and interestingly, ended up with going to a meeting at something called the Gandhi Peace Foundation, which is a Gandhian institution based in Delhi. And they were beginning to discuss the issue at that stage of big dams and forestry. And there was just a beginning of an interest in India on the issue of environment. And as a student, I ended up going to this meeting just because this subject had some resonance with me. And I ended up with meeting there actually two more students who had come from different schools of Delhi. And we ended up with getting to know each other and getting to understand that we were all passionate about this so-called issue on environment, which we knew nothing about much. And we formed a students group called Kalprich, which you may have even heard of. It was a students group, and we were all in school at that time. And all it meant was that there was some activism, as always is, because there were some trees being cut in Delhi, and we ended up in, saying you can't cut the trees and doing. Then we went off to see the Chipko movement in the Himalayas. And from there, my passion just grew. And I think my most defining moment, if I may say, and I think about it often, was my trip to the Himalayas. Because when I went there and I met the women of Chamoli, and we talked about why environment should matter to them. Why should they be protecting the trees? And this was just after a decade after this very famous Chipko movement had happened. And when I heard from them the importance of the trees in their own survival, in their own lives, and their fight for environment being a fight for self-determination, in some senses, the politics of environment resonated with me. And I think that's my inspiration, because environment for me is not a technical issue. It's not a fix-it issue. It's an issue of the rights of people, of the development of a country like India, and of course today the future of the world. So I mean, I'm sure all of you will agree, this is an issue that inspires all of us. This is an issue which makes all of us stand up and want to be part of the solution, because you have to be. So I think that's my journey.
True. And ma'am, the fact that that this is your story where you began is very much visible in your work, how you believe that environment is also a very much a justice issue and a very much a people's issue. So I kind of understand where that comes from now. Ma'am, you were associated with activism based on research and knowledge,
Yes.
which is backed by facts and science, which was, I think, very new at the time you founded this organization, because otherwise activism was more like a movement rather than something that could be studied. And CSE, the Center for Science and Environment, is very much based on the same ideology that activism should come along with knowledge and research. So were there any structural roadblocks you faced as a researcher, as an environmentalist, when starting like CSE, or when actually beginning your work, considering the governments at that point of time, or even people in general were not very friendly, or were like not accepting of research, especially oriented with climate change?
So Pratyush, firstly, I need this record to be clear. I did not found CSC. It was really Anil Agarwal who was, and remember, and that's where our legacy is. And that's why it's easy for me today to run the institution, because I have this very rich legacy. Anil was actually an engineer from IIT Kanpur and then became a journalist. And he set up CSE saying that what we are creating is an institution which is at the cusp of both the media and research. Because academic research is very important, but it often tells you the story some years after the event has happened. And by then, yes, you need to learn, but society's attention span has been lost. Journalists tell you the snapshot. They just tell you, okay, today this is happening. But what you need is an ability to do rigorous research, and we say it's forensic level research, where you deep dive, you look at issues, you meet people, you look at the gaps, you understand from the voices of people what are the issues, and then you take it to the next level of what is the policy that you need to do. So in some senses, CSE today is, and it's a tough, and I'll come to that, how difficult it is, because that's your question. But if I could describe CSE, it's really about, you've all heard of Greenpeace, which is an activist organization. Or you may have heard of think tanks, like, I don't know, in the US you have WRI, or you have many others who are Brookings and others, think tank. So we have situated CSE somewhere in the middle. And I do want, and I think all of us at CSE are very clear, that we want to drive change more directly. So, but we are not the kind of activists, we don't even know how to do that. If you ask me to go out on the roads and hold up a flag and do a dharna and do a protest, well, that's not what we do. But we use our information, our research, to drive. And we are not polite people, we're not nice people, we're not genteel people. So we will push and push and push to try and see how we can drive the change. Now, obviously, that is not convenient and that is not acceptable. And I can tell you, every one of our campaigns has always had a huge amount of pushback. If you look at what we did on air pollution, we got a 100 crore legal suit at that time from an automobile major because we were saying diesel was a problem. Okay, when we worked on pesticides, I still have criminal defamation suits against me, and the pesticide industry does what in the US is called SLAPP cases. SLAPP means strategic lawsuits against public participation. And those are cases which actually, you know, just are harassment cases. So for instance, the pesticide industry files criminal defamations in Delhi. And as we start winning the case, they go and file it in Mumbai. 2 years ago, I had a policeman outside our office to arrest me. Why? That I have a non-bailable warrant against you because a case has been filed in Vapi, which we had no idea about. No notices were ever served to us, and yet a non-bailable warrant was issued. Now the police in Delhi like us, they like our work, they believe in what we do. So the man actually said to me, you know, man, we don't want to arrest you. You know, just disappear for a week and find a way, you know, deal with it. So, you know, so we have, I mean, the one good thing, and I want to say that, Pratyush, is because I don't want to be a victim here and I don't want to overplay this. There is always a pushback. But the good thing is that when you work in society and you work for society, there is also an enormous support you get. I mean, when we tested Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola for pesticide residues, and their sales fell to 10% in India, you can imagine the outrage of these companies, the anger of these companies. But we had huge support. We've never had to pay a lawyer in the Supreme Court. I mean, they, as I always say when people file defamations against us, I say, you know, you have to pay the most expensive lawyers. We get pro bono support from the best lawyers of India. So there is enormous societal support. And the bottom line of this, and I just want to end here, Pratyush, is I think the most important thing for us at CSE and for me personally is we must remain credible. We must remain independent. People must know when we put out the facts that we are not paid by one group or another group. We are independently doing this research and we're doing it in the public interest. So CSE till now has never taken projects from industry. We do not even take a consultancy from government. We are in the public interest. And I think that has meant we haven't grown that big, but we remain what we are. So I think there's a cost, but there's also a huge, huge reward to it.
I agree. And with time, CSE has like expanded their fields they kind of cover. Like today, it's just not climate change. It's about waste management, about various aspects of climate change, urbanization, and how industries are affecting. And which has been really exciting to see so much work being done, especially because your organization is not that large in terms of employees. So that's a really effective way of managing such a large scale organization in terms of outreach with such a small number of people working for it. There have been so many great achievements you've talked about, ma'am. Taking down a big company is of course an achievement, and holding them accountable for some damage they're causing is a really difficult thing to do, I must say. So what do you think, in your opinion, has been CSE's greatest achievement or one of the greatest achievements?
If you ask me, Pratyush, I think our biggest achievement has been our work on water. And, you know, some many years ago, and we did this research on called Dying Wisdom. It was a book that we brought out, and it was a book documenting the traditional systems of water harvesting across India. And the book really argued that India has, and I think that's in South Asia, it's not just India, it's South Asia, has this amazing tradition of harvesting every drop of water. We were extremely wise and prudent in the way we used our water resources, and we were ecologically diverse, which meant that we used systems which were appropriate to each different ecosystem. So we had a technological ingenuity, we had ecological rationality, and we had societal wisdom in the way we used our water. And I can only tell you, Pratyush, that when this book came out in the mid-90s, the kind of, I mean, Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, diesel lobby, pesticide lobby, all those, you know, the conservation lobby who attacked me on the tiger position, all those are still a small, you know, not so virulent. It was the water engineers lobby, which really came out in force to say that these ideas were just not applicable. That a country like India just could not afford to do decentralized water harvesting technologies, that we needed to think only about big solutions, big engineering solutions, because that was all that would work. And our position was that we are not against the big. I'm still not against the big. We're not saying don't build a dam, but the fact is rain is decentralized. So catch it where it falls. It makes so much more sense. And catch it where it falls so that you can also build local, resilient agriculture. You can build local, resilient livelihoods. And I think that's the, I mean, I find that very, very rewarding today, Pratyush, that fight of the 90s today is so well accepted. Nobody will deny this. No, it's part of policy. It's part of people's understanding that, yes, this
Yes, ma'am. I agree to what you said about like the time when you actually began research. There was not a lot of acceptance, and with time, I think we've had a generational understanding of the evident consequences of climate change, and I think that has made us realize that it is real, like it's right in front of us. Um, we've all seen, and as you've mentioned, CSE has lobbied really hard for rainwater harvesting, and how it is more about water management rather than water conservation, because if we have floods at one place in India, we have droughts at the other place. So it's definitely about getting the water to be stored and then structuring it to like helping where the scarcity actually strikes. Why do you think CSE has lobbied so hard for like rainwater harvesting particularly?
well, I think it's, you know, Pratyush, today the whole um, from across the country. And I was making the point that just think about it. I mean, the world has moved, leaped ahead, our world, India. You're too young to remember this, Pratyush, and many of your friends on the panel are also too young to remember this. But let me remind you that India did not have connectivity for, you know, till very recently. And getting a telephone line was one of the most hellish experiences that each one of us faced, because it was a landline system, and, you know, and the phone lines were not available, and you had to go and get, it was like the ultimate favor that somebody did to you in government to give you a telephone line. Today, it's satellite telephony, and, you know, you've just leaped. And it's widely said that, you know, we've done a leapfrog on that. Today, the world is talking about, instead of doing a grid, let's do a mini grid. Let's look at solar mini grids. I mean, so that you can actually provide energy where it is needed most. Because even if you build a grid, as we have in India, and we have reached almost, the grid has reached 99% of the country, but that doesn't mean households have got energy. So maybe a better, nimbler solution is to do more local energy generation. So you're talking about decentralized energy solutions. Now, it makes so much sense to do decentralized water solutions and decentralized sewage management solutions. And that's really where the new game for countries like India is. I mean, the fact is, till now, we have built our water systems, and many of you are from Mumbai. So just think about it. Mumbai gets its water from the Western Ghats, and you get your water from the reservoirs that are built in the Western Ghats. And many of you may have read how communities living around these reservoirs complain that they don't get water supply, but the water supply is pumped and piped from there all the way, many kilometers, miles away to Mumbai city. The pumping of the water, the piping of the water adds to distribution losses. It basically means that you have more costly water by the time the water reaches the city of Mumbai. Now, on the other hand, you have, every time it rains in Mumbai, you have floods. Every time you go under. Now, clearly, if the city was to protect its own wetlands, its own lakes and ponds, I mean, you have the Powai Lake, but the Powai Lake today is completely surrounded with houses all around it. Its catchment has been destroyed. The Mithi River in Mumbai is technically called a drain today. I mean, just imagine for people in Mumbai, and it's the same for people in Delhi, but the people in Mumbai, look at what you have lost. I mean, if one generation has lost a freshwater river, I mean, how much bigger a loss can they be? I mean, we talk about extinction of species, but you have lost a river. A river has been converted officially into a drain. It's the same thing in Delhi. We had Sahibi River, a freshwater river from the Aravallis flowing into Yamuna. It's today called the Najafka drain, and it's the dirtiest drain bringing sewage into the river. So I think this is where we need to rethink urban planning, urban thinking, so that you were to harvest the rain where it falls, you recharge your groundwater, you do flood management at the same time, and then if you can do sewage management in a way that you treat your sewage and you put back the treated effluent again into the water bodies locally, you can actually build a water secure city. And Pratyush, this becomes so important because this is what climate change will mean for us. Climate change in the Indian context, and we are seeing it already, means extreme rain events. We will get more rain in fewer number of rainy days. We are seeing that in Mumbai. We are seeing that in Ahmedabad. We are seeing that in Delhi. We are seeing it across the country. It no longer rains, it pours. And we in a city cry when it doesn't rain, we cry when it rains. And that's really the challenge of reinventing our cities for rainwater harvesting and for decentralized sewage in the future.
I agree to that, ma'am. Like you said, that at a point, a city might witness scarcity in water and water resources. And within a few days, they will have a 30% or a 40% surplus in their rain, which we've witnessed in forms of floods in a lot of places. So recently, India witnessed floods in Assam. And this is not the first time this has happened. This is one of the most evident consequences of climate change, as you mentioned, and it also has to do about how urbanization has increased to such a level that the flow of Brahmaputra River, where you actually require Brahmaputra to come and add to the fertility of the soil and rejuvenate the soil for farming. So it's more like Brahmaputra is doing its job, like it's adding to the fertility of the grounds, which at the end benefits us.
You're welcome.
But again, urbanization, people are living just everywhere because the population density is just so high. So what, in your opinion, should be India's way of managing floods in such places, considering the population density is not a very easy problem we can immediately solve? And Assam has witnessed floods again and again, causing loss of life, loss of land, and loss of great wildlife also.
So Pratyush, three things here. One, let's be clear that India's flood problem is growing not just in Assam, Bihar, but there are new regions becoming flood prone and that's the clear link with climate change. And climate change for India is a double whammy because On one hand, you're getting extreme rain events, which are leading to floods. And on the other hand, you're also mismanaging your land and water resources, which is exacerbating that impact of climate change as well. So it's a double whammy for us. And that's what something we have to understand. So in the context of Assam or Bihar or anywhere else, you're already mismanaging your land and water resources, exactly as you said. You're building where you should not build. You're destroying your wetlands. I mean, you're destroying the sponges that would have absorbed the flood water. People are living on the floodplains where they should never be living. And as a result of it, the flood partly is because of our own mismanagement. And then you're getting these extreme rain events, which are making it much worse. So that's really the tragedy today. And it's a human tragedy, Pratyush, and that's something we must remember always. We must keep the human face of the tragedy in front of our eyes at all times. Because each one of these floods makes the poor even poorer. It forces them into a vicious cycle of debt and indebtedness. Because on one hand, they take money, they get debt, and they try and do agriculture, they try and build some livelihood. The government invests in building a school, drinking water, doing something with toilets, whatever. And then you get a flood, you get a cyclone, and that just wipes away the development dividend, wipes away people's whatever little livelihood that they had. And they get into a more and more in debt, more and more a vicious cycle of poverty, and that's really the human face. And the poor of the world, not just in India, but in Africa, are not the cause of climate change. They are our victims. And that's something we must also remember. So what then is the solution? The solution has to be, and this is why I say this, that we have to get a new science of what I would call environmental engineering to really think in India and to practice that in our countries. Because as yet, engineering has been a very linear thinking profession. And when you look at floods, the whole attitude is, okay, so we have to bind down the river. We have to build embankments so that the water does not flow. Now, that has just not worked over the last 50 years. We've had Flood Commission report. We've had others to say the embankment strategy is not working. Our rivers are just too massive, just too wild. And you cannot tame nature. You cannot just bind down your rivers. So what you need to do is to think, how do I live with that flood? How do I make sure that the flood water, which used to give me an advantage in the past, how do I make sure that that flood water I can distribute across so that I don't lose livelihoods, that I can actually use the flood to recharge groundwater, and I can use the flood to rebuild my agriculture because it is bringing me silt, it is bringing me water. It is the gain of the flood has to be optimized on. And that's really something that we are not doing enough. We are still very, we're driven by this very, and I'm sorry, I'm going to use a word which I hope people don't mind, but a very masculine view of the world, which is, just nature is there to be tamed. And nature is telling us that, whether it's Corona and the revenge of the bug or anything else, nature is telling us that, listen, I'm not really there for you to play around.
Yeah, I agree to that, ma'am, completely, that we cannot tame nature. And India being a country with vast geographic conditions, we've experienced all kinds of manifestations of climate change, like extreme heat, and then the locust attack, which happened in North India, and then again, floods, as you mentioned. And it all comes with one problem: climate change. I would like to shift our gears and talk about one very important aspect of climate change, as you mentioned, that it is very important to humanize climate change. As we know, climate change has disadvantagedly affected the minority communities as well as the communities that belong to the lower socioeconomic status. And as you mentioned, the poorest people, despite being the least contributors, are the worst affected sections of the society. What do you think India should do to tackle this? Is there a middle ground to prevent the unequal effects of climate change on these communities and also tackle climate change?
So, Pratyush, firstly, for India, climate change is not our priority. Our priority has to be development, and our priority has to be local environment. Okay. Um, Climate change, even if India stopped breathing, let's say we stopped everything, our emissions, maybe in total volume, we may be high, but the fact is, on a per capita basis, we are so minuscule that you really need to think about whether we are today going to be the answer to climate change. I mean, for most of you, as you're based in the US, you must remember you are the problem. Okay. I mean, the US is the problem, and whether you know, whether it's Trump or whether it's President Obama of the past, I think the US policy on climate change has really meant that the world has never come up with a truly transformational cooperative policy. And the US entire efforts to control climate change are still too pathetic. I mean, I'm not even going to mince my words on this and try and be polite. I mean, they are pathetic. Now, given that, what should India do? What should India's policy be? We are definitely going to be impacted by climate change. The poor in India are definitely the victims of climate change, but it's also very clear that climate change is not linear. It's going to jump, it's going to accelerate. And if the poor are impacted yesterday, we are all impacted tomorrow. So we must be part of the solution. There is no doubt in my mind. Now, this is where a country like India must look, and what we are pushing for is what we call the co-benefit approach. That you're looking for solutions that work for us and work for climate change as well. Now, let me give you a few that I think would be of interest to all of you. So, as you know, I work a lot on air pollution and air pollution in Delhi. I've been pushing, we've been kicking, we've been fighting, we brought in, we pushed for compressed natural gas in early 2000s. Since then, we've been fighting against diesel. Now, it's very clear to us that the answer to air pollution, whether it's Delhi, whether it's Mumbai, whether it's any other city of India or any other city of the world, in fact, I would argue with you, the answer is not going to be in cleaning up individual cars. So this entire approach of cleaning up the fuel or cleaning up the emissions of vehicles is not going to work. Why? Think of Delhi. Delhi, 10%, 15% of Delhi owns a car. 10% of Delhi drives a car for its commute. This is a reverse opposite of, say, Washington, D.C., when 90% of people, and this is US data, US government's own data, 90% of people take a car to commute. We have 10% of the people who commute by car, and we are a rich city of India. We then have 20% of people in Delhi who take two-wheelers. So 30% are on private vehicles. 70% of Delhi still is on public transport. We take a bus, a metro, people walk, people cycle. But they do that because they're poor. They don't do it because they're rich and they're middle class and they're wanting to exercise. They do it, and they do it in spite of the fact that our roads are never designed for them. They are invisible people. The maximum deaths that happen on roads happen to cyclists because nobody cares about cyclists. Now, this is the co-benefit answer. We have massive air pollution problem. And that air pollution problem is coming from 10% of people who drive, who occupy 90% of the road space today. We don't have the road space for the remaining 90% to come on. We don't have the air shed. Now, therefore, India's investment into massive, massive public transport systems in a way that we will transform mobility so that we are not getting people, we are moving people and not moving vehicles. A transformation. I mean, that will be so good for the world in terms of fighting climate change, but so good for us because we will reduce local air pollution. The same thing comes to energy. I mean, today the poor women of our world, are today suffering because they are the ones who use biomass, chulas, cook stoves to cook their food. They use cow dung, they use twigs, they use whatever they can get, and they are faced with massive health impacts because of the dirty fuel they use in their stoves. But please remember, Pratyush, that it is every time that woman cooks her food using biomass, she's damaging her own lungs. But because she uses biomass, she is not using fossil fuel and she is not contributing to climate change. So she is actually helping us, even though she's killing herself. Now, this is the co-benefit option. If we were to think about a leapfrog strategy where that poor woman goes from biomass directly to solar energy so that she can get clean electricity in her house, but at affordable rates, because biomass is non-monetized. So we should not talk about solar energy like, why doesn't that poor woman use solar energy? Solar use kariye. It's a huge cost. And we must understand that if solar was so cheap, then why hasn't all the world converted to solar? It's not that easy. So I think it's very important for us to understand the politics of power, understand the politics of the need for inclusion of poor communities in a sustainability agenda.
As you mentioned, ma'am, that all the countries which had power a few years back contributed a lot to climate change before we realized it was a problem. Like you've referred to largest polluters such as Australia, Japan, and US amongst as umbrella group, who kind of contributed and weren't held accountable because the other countries were more focused on development, and we never realized it was a problem then. And it is evident how these countries now push for sustainable development and alternate cleaner technologies, but have blatantly ignored the realities of underdeveloped and developing countries, which has made global agreements difficult to follow. And as you say, alternate technologies do not come at a cheaper cost. And a country which is in the middle of a war, a country which is struggling to make its ends meet for its people, it's just impossible to talk about cleaner technologies. What, in your opinion, should global cooperation look like, considering the largest polluters weren't held accountable, and today the only way they push for is cleaner technology?
So they push for cleaner technology only when they have a technology that they would like us to buy, okay? Be very clear about it. There is no altruism over here, okay? There is only hard, the only agreement in the world that has been successful up till now has been the ozone, the Montreal Agreement. And why was the Montreal Agreement successful? Because DuPont, who first made the hole in the stratospheric ozone layer because of CFC, had another compound called HCFC, which they wanted to now to sell to all of us as a substitute. And now they have another compound called HFC, which they want us to buy. So, let's be very clear about this, Pratyush, that, I'm not saying I certainly can't change the world, but I can at least call a spade a spade. And the spade a spade is very clear that these technologies are only there when they have an interest in selling it to us, okay? And that's when the technology becomes part of the conversation. But the fact is, and I think this is what all of us must understand and be worried about, the fact is the world is not solving the climate change problem, okay? And it's not about the rich or the poor. It's, rich countries talk so glibly about climate change and the fact that they are leaders in climate change. But what are they doing today? Let's understand that. They are talking about what is called a net zero approach. What is a net zero approach means? That I will emit, but I will also remove my emissions, and I will remain, therefore, on a net zero trajectory. Now, what does that removal of emissions mean? I will plant trees in countries of the South, which will sequester carbon, and that then will go into my account, and then I will remain net zero. We are not talking about reducing consumption. We are not talking about increasing the cost of energy. We are talking about finding some smart ways of selling credits, trading in cheap emission credits, so that we can keep believing that we are fixing climate change. And the tragedy in this, Pratyush, is that we do not have enough global leadership, whether it's from the civil society or from governments, who can call out this game. I mean, we need to understand the problem of climate change and the existential problem of climate change, and the fact that we will have to do something more. And the reason I so firmly believe in the issue of equity and climate justice is because I know that without climate justice, you can never get an effective agreement on climate change. You can't tell Indians not to burn coal, but you can tell Indians not to burn coal if you have a just and a cooperative agreement which says, I'm going to be reducing as well, you need to reduce as well, and if you have to increase, we will give you money and technology so that you can move towards cleaner technologies, cleaner pathways of growth. So I think a just, cooperative global agreement is absolutely essential.
Ma'am, as you talk, India's focus is development because we're clearly a developing nation, and the coexistence of ideas of development and environment have been very difficult to imagine without compromising one of them. Industries and factories have been set up in communities that have affected tribal communities, wildlife, and fueled ecological imbalance. What do you envision the road to development for India, considering the environmental impacts we might cause? And how do you think, what can be the best trade-off between these and creating the most balance?
So the best trade-off, Pratyush, is democracy. The difference between India and China. Okay, let's be clear about that. If we continue to deepen and strengthen our democracy, then we will find a way to balance growth with the environmental imperative. Because poor people will protest about the mine that will happen, which is destroying their water resources. The poor will protest against the power plant, which is polluting their local environment. And if that protest is heard, if the courts remain strong, then you will find corrective action. There is no one answer, but you will find corrective action. However, as across the world, you are seeing a deepening, a weakening of the democratic movements in the world. You're seeing a weakening of the voices of poor people to be able to make their point heard. And that's where I feel today that the environmental crisis in India will grow now more than ever before, because we will not have the check and balance of the community who will be able to say, not in my backyard. Please understand, Pratyush, not in my backyard is a very, very powerful concept used by the rich in the world to say, don't build the incinerator in my backyard. But it becomes the most powerful environmental concept when the poor in the world say, don't build the incinerator in my backyard. Because if the poor say not in my backyard, it will have to move to the front yard of the rich. And that's when the incinerator will not pollute. So I think it's very important for understand. I can give you many other things, but to me, the most fundamental thing for us to make sure that we have a balance between environment and development is to make sure that we deepen our democracy and we give voice to the voiceless. This will keep us different from China, but we are not, we want to be like China, unfortunately. And that's the problem. Not we, some people.
Yeah, I agree to that, ma'am. And I think the idea of equitable development is very important because it kind of takes the idea of development and also add justice to it, which is very important to the communities who've by large already suffered a lot in the past because of lack of policy or lack of interest in the area which was affecting them. But it is also a fact that I think you will definitely agree to, that we live in a very inequitable world where growth is mostly not inclusive. Economic marginalization has been a big issue, and considering the effective pandemic, it is projected to even get worse, not only for India, but for around the world. So, according to you, where should the work for an equitable growth begin, especially in a post pandemic world?
So, Pratyush, one thing is very clear in our world that if you don't have equitable growth, you can't have sustainability. Okay, so let's be clear about that. You can't clean up your rivers if the shit of everybody in your cities is not treated. And you cannot treat the shit of everybody if you don't have an affordable sanitation system which reaches everybody. So, inclusive growth is integral to sustainability. But it's also very clear that the COVID has really hit the poor in the world the worst. I mean, it's the poor in India, it's the black in America. It's about the marginalized, the disadvantaged have been hit twice. One, because their livelihoods have been destroyed, and two, because they are more at risk of the infection. And that's really the tragedy of COVID, that it is hit where the poor live and where, and hit them the worst. But the upside of COVID is, and this is a small upside, and let's sort of concentrate on it as well, is that it has made the invisible visible. For the first time across India, you saw these massive numbers of people moving from your cities back to their villages. People in Mumbai, people in Delhi didn't even know these people lived in our cities, that they provided this enormous service of doing everything that made our cities tick, our industries work. But that's the big thing that it did. It brought those people and, of course, their misery into our homes. We cried because we saw how terrible it was for them to even go home. But today, this is the big choice we have now. I mean, globalization has been built on the model of cheap labor and cheap environmental. So you discount the cost of labor, you discount environmental cost, which is why all industry has moved to our part of the world, because in our part of the world, no environmental costs need to be paid. And in our world also, when you have an industrial area where the costs have to be paid and you have regulatory costs, industry moves to where the poor live, so that the costs don't have to be paid. So this really is about that globalization model where we have discounted the cost of labor and environment. Can we actually, in a post-COVID world, talk about welfare of the poor? Can we talk about how when workers come to our industries to work, that they get affordable housing, they get wages, they get well-being? When they go back to their villages, can we talk about rejuvenating, regenerating villages so that we invest in resilient economies? You know, that's really the opportunity. But I think we are losing it. I mean, you know, COVID is playing out in our world. Cases are mounting. Misery is mounting. We are not acting fast enough to do something to fix what can be fixed and build a truly different economy for the future.
I completely agree to that, ma'am, that COVID has impacted our health, definitely, like it's a pandemic, but it has also brought out a lot of things that we could not visibly see. For example, the air quality index in the most polluted cities of India has dropped down since the factories and the industries went in a lockdown. So we witnessed how we were actually impacting the environment. The second thing, in my opinion, we have witnessed is a complete lack of global leadership, a complete lack of a spearheading organization which is successful in handling something of this scale, be it World Health Organization or the United Nations, which definitely as people or as countries have questioned that, is global cooperation really the way? Is World Health Organization really that effective as we assumed it to be? What do you think should global cooperation look like for India in the coming years ahead? Because the present government has maybe done a lot of work to have an international position for India, considering we recently got the temporary membership in the United Nations Security Council, and We were also invited for the G20 summit. So do you think there's an impact India can make on the global scale?
It depends on the role that India wants to play. I mean, at the end of the day, global leadership is critical. I'll be very clear with you, Pratyush, that however much I may criticize WHO, and I do criticize WHO and global leadership today, I don't see an alternative. I mean, what COVID has told us is that we live in an interdependent, interconnected world. The virus moved from Wuhan, China, to across the world in a matter of days, if not weeks. Okay. Today we have locust attacks in Western Rajasthan, in Gujarat, but the only way to control the locusts will be to actually work with African countries in the Horn of Africa, because that's the breeding ground for locusts as well. Air pollution knows no boundaries. Climate change knows no boundaries. So actually what the world today is, the crises of today telling us that we have to have global leadership. There is absolutely no doubt about that. Now, what role can a country like India plays? It depends on what we want to do. I mean, I think right now, all we want is a place on the high table. But the high table is made up of people who are absolutely, essentially leaders in the world who are selfish men who want to lead their countries as if they were dictators, and they were, they believe in self-interest rather than global interest. So will India be able to bring something different to the table? Will India be able to bring a more just democratic way of doing things to the table? Show that how its own country is doing things differently? Or does India just want a high table, a place on the table of polluters and, and masculine leaders? It depends on what India wants to do. And I think that's really a big open question still for me.
Agreed, ma'am. Before we move on to audience question, I had one question about a recent development that happened. So recently, the LG polymer plant in Visakhapatnam, where the styrene gas leak happened on May 7, was the cause of a plant had been running over 2 decades without clearances. Moreover, the new draft Environment Impact Assessment EIA 2020 will allow projects that have come up without environmental safeguards or without getting environmental clearances to carry out their operation under the provisions of the new draft. What are your opinions about this new draft? Because there has been a lot of criticism about it and how it should be pulled back and reversed to its original form, because, considering it doesn't put environment in priority in this particular draft.
So the EIA notification, draft notification of government is a further weakening of the provisions of the environmental safeguards in the country. But Pratyusha, I'm not losing sleep over it because it's actually already dead, okay? I mean, you look at it today, the environmental clearances, there is no project that is not cleared in India. All projects are cleared. It's a matter of time. It's a matter of faceless committees who meet in the Ministry of Environment, and in 99.9%, they clear the project. And in the 0.1% that they don't clear the project, they say, oh, we are giving you so many conditions that you have to meet, and those conditions are non-implementable. So the project in any case happens. So, Pratyush, we in India today have two problems. One, we have an environmental framework which has become complex, corrupt, and inefficient. On the other hand, we have an effort to try and weaken it further. Now, somebody like me is sitting in the middle and saying, do I really want to defend this environmental safeguard? Yes, to some extent, because it's all we have. But on the other hand, it's not working. And if I talk about the reform of that and the strengthening of it, nobody wants to listen. Whether it is the UPA government or the NDA government, we have gone to government saying, please reform the environmental clearance process to make it efficient, to make it effective. Okay? But no government wants to do that because corruption is good for everyone. including the consultants and all the people who have a vested interest in keeping that environmental law going. So we are in deep, deep trouble, because people like me who would stand out normally and defend the environmental regulations of the country, I really can't. I can't get myself to do so. I just don't feel that I will be true to myself if I stand up and say the EIA is the best thing. No, it's a terrible instrument by now, because we have whittled it down, we have destroyed it, we have made it so that it's not an environmental assessment, it's an environmental clearance mechanism.
Thank you, ma'am. I will now shift to the audience questions. It's already 12:30. Can we extend by like 5 minutes to entertain
Yes.
a few audience questions?
Yes.
Thank you so much,
Yeah.
ma'am. We have a question which is, it's from an anonymous attendee. It is, since 15 to 51%, depending on the measure used, of global GHG emissions come from animal agriculture, and the US is a big culprit. How do we evaluate fighting factory farms and animal exploitation in the climate justice movement?
So, a very good question, but let me be very frontal about this, Pratyush, because my position has been, I'm a vegetarian, but I don't argue for vegetarianism. Okay, so we are, CSC's position and my position on this is that yes, agriculture is a big contributor to GHG emissions, and meat is in particular a big contributor to GHG emissions. But the answer and the solution is not to say that nobody should eat meat, but the answer is to say that we stop doing industrial farming. Because the way we are growing our meat today, we are manufacturing our meat today, is by destroying rainforests, by doing industrial farming in which we chemicalize our farming system. We give growth promoters to our animals. The highest antibiotic use in the US is not for humans, it is for livestock. And something we have to remember always, that is the method of farming that we need to stop. And we need to reduce the amount of meat we eat. So that to me would be part of the humane food system of the world. And I say this because meat in the Indian context, where a farmer keeps a few cattle, is important also because for the farmer, the cattle and the meat is part of their economy. And the cattle play a very important role in agriculture. So it's very important for us to have a nuanced position on this. And that's why I thought I would explain this.
Ma'am, do you also believe that vegetarianism will not solve the climate change problem, as you've mentioned?
I think it's too simplistic, Pratyush, because vegetarianism is, you could grow soya, because today vegetarian is turning out to be soya hamburgers. Soya grown in that same industrial farming method and processed in large factories is as bad. So, we need to understand that environmentalism demands us to be far more, what's the word for it, rigorous with our facts and thinking, and there are no bland answers to this.
Ma'am, another question we have is from someone who says, personally, a lot of our activism is often met with criticism and that we are being too idealistic. And sometimes this criticism is true. In your career, have you experienced this, and how have you navigated through this readjustment?
Pratyush, that's a simple answer. I do what I do. Beyond the point, if you keep worrying about what people think of, so we understand the reality and we speak for the reality of India. And beyond that, I really can't. I don't care. Okay.
Let this be the last question. this is from probably from someone from Mumbai. The question is, what do you think about the Mumbai coastal road development? The
I
project has been stopped several times by environmentalists. However, ultimately it is still being developed. Do you think activism and environmentalism don't make major impacts in third world countries like India?
No, I'm not sure that's a fact. I mean, the fact is, you yourself said it's been stopped many times. But honestly, I have not taken a deep look at it. I mean, the fact is, roads, I mean, the coastal road project also has big advantages. It decongests Mumbai in a very big way. Now, to me, if Mumbai had made the coastal road by saying the coastal road will not be for cars, the coastal road will only be for buses and cyclists. Or it was to say that the road that cuts through from Nariman Point all the way up, the main road of Mumbai, we're going to keep that only for trains, buses, and cyclists, and let the cars take a different route. I mean, you know, I think we need to be far more, that's one of the things that I would look at. But I don't know the impact on the coastal ecology, so I'm not able to speak. I know that a lot of environmentalists in Mumbai have been concerned with the coastal ecology, but I don't know the details of it. I'm not able to give a comment whether it's good or bad.
To the end, a lot of young people have been interested to be a part of the environment activism. And we saw Fridays for Future, where a lot of students around the world walked out of their classrooms in protest for climate action. These are the campaigns which, in my opinion, are very temporary in their nature for a particular period. How do you think, or what do you suggest is the way in which young people can get involved in environmental activism, and and a way which is more sustainable, which lasts and has a more impact?
So, Pratyush, see, Fridays for Future is very important because it's giving a voice to the young. And as I see it, as the young get older, there should be more young that join the young. So it's a sustainable movement per se, Pratyush, if the momentum can be kept, because as you will get older, you will move out of, roadside activism, and you will move to something else. But there will be another generation of young people. And I think the voice of the young is very important. And I am very clear about it because it is able to talk truth to power. It has a particular anger and a passion. It's important for that movement to continue. And I also, a lot of people have said, why don't you go out and support it? And I've said, no, the movement does not need people like me. In fact, the movement, because it is a movement of the young, has so much more credibility, so much more power, so much more energy. And I think that's how we need to keep the Fridays for Future. But the young, obviously, there's a lot more that can be done. And to me, environmental activism should stay in whatever work you do. And that's really where the future of the world has to be, that, you must not move from being an activist when you're young to becoming a staid professor when you're old. You need to somehow make sure that you remain an activist all your life. And that's really the strength of being able to make the difference wherever you are, whatever you're doing, and stay true to your beliefs, your ideals, your principles. That's important.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for joining us and sharing a lot of your wisdom, your struggles, and your experiences. It helps us like look at the side of environmentalism and activism, which we might not know, because coming from you, it is coming from the other side of the table, somebody who's fought these companies, who's struggled, and who's also researching currently on various issues that impact India and the larger world. I will now invite Shubham to propose the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Pratyush. It was a great session. And ma'am, it was great to hear your journey today and all the various initiatives you've been working on across the length and breadth of the country. Despite being faced by so many hurdles, overcoming them with, as you said, all the pushing, kicking, and fighting. Very interestingly, I think you busted so many common myths for our audience. Like some as basic as how a decentralized, water harvesting system, like a dam, is not the answer, and we need to think more efficiently and innovatively. Thank you so much for being candid. It definitely helped us develop very strong perspective on environmental activism. Thank you. And finally, our audience, thank you so much for staying with us today. And we hope you got a lot out of the session today, because Ms. Narain is, I think, the stamp on environmental activism when it comes to India. And we hope we take some inspiration from the session today, and we keep working towards the environmental reasonable growth of India. So yeah, thank you so much. And please follow us on all our social media pages. And we look forward to hosting many more such events for you in the next weeks. Thank you.
Thank you, Shubham. Thank you, Pratyush. Bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye.